Hi guys, and welcome to our first lecture around Dracula. I know you've already done a lot for the critical reading practice sheet and watching the intro to literary analysis, so I'm going to keep this fairly brief, but I wanted to get you guys situated a little bit before you read these first two chapters for homework today. So I started you guys out here on this slide with this nifty steam train, and part of that is because our novel is really going to begin with a train journey. We're going to meet a guy named Jonathan Harker who's traveling off on business to go and meet with this noble in a foreign country. The steam engines were a pretty big innovation still for the Victorians, so that's definitely one place where technology intersects our novel pretty intensely. You'll see several other spots, and part of the reason for that is because we are traveling back to the Victorian era. 1859, I believe, is when our novel came out. And the Victorian era was a time of really big expansion and innovation in a lot of ways. So we've got a bunch of technologies coming to fruition, kind of coming out into the public sphere. Lots of science, lots of innovation in science. And of course, the British Empire expanded hugely during this time. So we've also got people's horizons expanding and people kind of coming to understand other people and finding a lot of conflicts as they get out into the world and meet other people and live more closely with other people. So we'll look at that as we go along. But I think this is one of the big things I really want you guys to be aware of as we read Dracula, is that a lot of what Stoker's playing with here is sort of the latest social problems, the latest innovations, the latest changes in work life. So I think that's one of the things that makes this a fairly interesting novel to get into. So this is our author, Bram Stoker. I wanted to just take a little bit of time to look at him, not a ton. So he lived 1847 to 1912, spanned a pretty good amount of the Victorian era. Yeah, there we go, 1897. I think I switched that a little bit. 1897 is when our book was published. A lot of critics really look at Stoker's childhood. So he was very sickly. He ended up spending a lot of his time as a child at home, and part of that involved listening to ghost stories. So apparently his mother told a lot of, not just ghosts, but supernatural stories. So his mother had a lot of stories from the countryside, kind of local lore. Maids in the house would have had a lot of supernatural stories, and he heard a lot of them because he didn't have a lot else that he was doing as a kid. He wasn't getting out and playing. He wasn't going to school. He was just hanging at home a lot. So he did finally recover enough to have some formal schooling, to go to school instead of just being schooled at home. He eventually worked as a civil servant. He did theater criticism on the side for quite a long time. And then he met this guy named Henry Irving, who was a big theater person. Theater director, owner, producer kind of person. Also an actor. There's actually some really cool images of Irving that I'll try to bring in later on, that people have said might have influenced the way that Stoker wrote the character of Dracula. So he worked for quite a while as a stage manager. He did some short story writing, but most of his writing took place after the death of Henry Irving. So, just very briefly, I want you guys to start getting a picture of who our author was, too. And the other thing I wanted to talk to you guys about very briefly is one of a number of types of novels that we'll think about as we read Dracula. and that's the epistolatory novel. Now, yeah, epistolary, sorry, the epistolary novel. I always think epistolatory. So Dracula is not strictly an epistolary novel. Those are novels that are really written as correspondences between one person and another. We get some of that in the novel, and that's part of why I wanted to bring it up right now. It's also a novel form that was really growing and popular in the century or so leading up to Dracula. So late 17, early 1800s, we had a pretty big boom of these kinds of novels. Pamela by Samuel Richardson was a big one. There was also a very, very large novel called Clarissa that was a huge hit. The standard epistolatory novel tends to have a female writer, often penned by men, but not always, writing to friends and family about the situations she's in. So, in the case of Clarissa, for example, there's a young woman, very, very wordy, very educated. Her family is trying to make her marry a dude who she doesn't want to marry. And she's got herself holed up in her room, kind of locked in, and she's writing and writing and writing. She gets responses back. There's a guy who comes into play who she thinks is going to be the person who helps her out of the situation, saves her. He's not a very nice guy in truth, not really the kind of person you want to connect yourself with. But she ends up having a lot of different correspondences with her friends, with him, basically trying to figure out how not to be forced to marry someone she doesn't want to marry. So that was one that was very popular. Pamela was one about a maid in a household, and the guy who owns the house is hoping to hook up with her, and she's trying to hold out for marriage. So there are a lot of letters between her and her family, her and her friends, her and the guy, talking about that whole situation. So probably the kind of thing we would today think of a lot as romance writing. But these were big novels, big popular novels at the time. And I think in Stoker we see a lot of influence from that in a number of ways. And we'll come back to that a little bit, especially as we look at the character of Jonathan Harker a little bit. And as we think about some critics' claims that Harker is actually standing in for the heroines of an earlier type of novel called the Gothic. So we'll look more at that in terms of writing. Part of what I wanted to say, because I really think this novel format has a huge impact on the way Dracula is written, is that this was a form, the epistolary novel, that really uses an unreliable, and I think pretty overtly unreliable narrator, a limited narrator. So these are told by the author as though we're hearing in the guise of whoever's being written to about these incidents. Now, if you think for yourself about communicating various incidents in your life with other people, you might think about things like how would you tell a story that you knew didn't show you in the best light if you wanted somebody to think well of you? How might you tell a story if you're talking to your parents or if you're talking to your friends, right? A good author will give us those same kinds of glossings over, omissions, poetic liberties that people always take in telling their stories. So as you read through letters, diaries, articles, the whole thing in Dracula, really think about who's talking, who they're talking to, and what we can read between the lines as well as what we see in the content of the novel itself. Okay, so that was a really brief introduction to the novel. I'm also going to include a really brief voice thread where I just get you going with reading the first chapter, because I think it can really help to hear it at the beginning. I also wanted to make sure you guys knew that you could download an audio copy from that Project Gutenberg site. I've heard that some chapters are better than others, but I've had students who've really enjoyed having that audiobook element as well. So you've got that. And I will see you next week on the discussion boards, I guess. I'm still trying to get my bearings on where we are and what we're doing at any moment. Anyway, go forth and be epic.